Chapter 8. An Angry Suspect. Bess was so startled to hear the name of the man the girls were searching for that she gasped and stepped back. Alonzo Rugby's eyes narrowed suspiciously as he came forward to acknowledge the introduction. Mr. Bradshaw looked at Susan and the girls, waiting for an explanation before giving their names to his assistant. I'm dreadfully sorry, said Bess, recovering. She giggled. I've heard Mr. Rugby is a famous artist. I was impressed to think I was actually meeting him. Mr. Bradshaw raised his eyebrows but did not comment. He introduced the girls to Rugby. I'm happy to meet you, the assistant said. I don't know where you heard about my being a great artist. The person must have mixed me up with Mr. Bradshaw. He's a great artist. I'm merely a pupil. Nancy was pleased that at last she had found Mrs. Dondo's brother. She thought, the first thing I must do is try to find out if his shoes fit my paper pattern. Nancy noticed that Rugby had taken off his street shoes and put on soft slippers. If she could only find some way to compare the size and shape of his shoes, as well as those of Mr. Bradshaw's, with her paper patterns. The young sleuth decided that the best way to accomplish this and to watch both men would be to visit the studio as often as possible. As an idea came to her, she said aloud, Mr. Bradshaw, I'm terribly intrigued by stained glass window making. I was wondering if you would mind giving me a few lessons while I'm visiting my cousin. The artist looked surprised and did not reply at once. Alonzo Rugby, however, said bluntly, Mr. Bradshaw is not only a great artist, but a very busy man, Miss Drew. Nancy was fearful that Mr. Bradshaw, backed by his assistant, might refuse her request. But Susan Carr came to her rescue. Smiling at Mr. Bradshaw, she coaxed, Oh, Nancy is not a beginner. She has attended art school. If Mr. Bradshaw had been wavering in his decision, he was persuaded by this remark. All right, he said. I'll be happy to give you a few lessons. Suppose you come tomorrow morning. Nancy was thrilled. Not only could she learn something from this very fine artist, but perhaps she could unravel the mystery about Mrs. Dondo's brother. If he's as bad as Mr. Dondo says, I'm surprised that Mr. Bradshaw would associate with him, Nancy said to herself. Then a troubling thought struck her. Were the two men in league? It doesn't seem possible, she decided. Mr. Bradshaw is such a gentleman. Aloud, she said, I'll be here by 10 o'clock. Thank you so much, Mr. Bradshaw. The girl detective had come close to the artist. Now she surreptitiously put her own foot near his and glanced down to make some quick mental measurements. It looked as if Mr. Bradshaw could definitely be eliminated as the suspect who had injured her. Nancy maneuvered to get near Alonzo Rugby's street shoes, which he had placed under the bench. She accomplished this when he walked away. As Nancy slid one foot alongside the pair, her heart leaped. The man would bear further investigation. While Mr. Bradshaw was showing the group a cartoon on which he was working, Alonzo Rugby took Bess by the arm and led her aside. Out of hearing of the others, he whispered, I want to give you a warning, miss. Don't let your friend come here to take lessons. Mr. Bradshaw's wife is the jealous type. A couple of times when he's had woman students, she made life miserable for them. So you had better keep your friend away from here. How do I know this is true? Bess asked airily. Alonzo Rugby said she would have to take his word for it. Before he could add anything, Mr. Bradshaw turned around. Better get back to the cutting table, Alonzo, he said pleasantly. We need that glass for tomorrow morning. Alonzo immediately returned to his work, and Bess joined the others. A few minutes later, Susan and her friends left the studio. As they rode towards Seven Oaks, Nancy asked Bess what she and Alonzo had been talking about. Making a date? George asked flippantly. Bess blushed and said indignantly, Of course not! But Nancy, you mustn't go there and take lessons from Mr. Bradshaw. Why not? Nancy asked in amazement. Bess repeated Rugby's warning. At once, Susan said, Why, that's utterly ridiculous. Alicia Bradshaw is one of the loveliest women I know. She most certainly is not jealous and never interferes with his work." Bess looked uncomfortable, and her cousin chided her. "I'm surprised at your falling for such a story," George said. "Well, I'm glad it happened," said Nancy. "Bess has been a bigger help than you give her credit for, George. This convinces me that Alonzo Rugby doesn't want me around that studio." "But why?" Susan asked. Nancy told them of her latest conclusions about the man who had peered in the window. "If he was Rugby, I'm going to find out," she said with determination. "He's dangerous!" Bess exclaimed. "Oh, Nancy, don't go to the studio!" Susan spoke up. "I think Bess is right. If he's the kind of person you think he is, you'd better cancel your appointment." Nancy said she did not want to miss this opportunity to ferret out the facts. "I'll be perfectly safe with Mr. Bradshaw there. I promise you that if he leaves the studio for long, I'll come home." Since it had been a busy day, the girls were glad to retire early. The next morning, Nancy took her cousin's car and set off for Waverly, the paper footprint in her purse. Bess and George were going to play golf with Susan. When Nancy reached the studio, both Mr. Bradshaw and his assistant were there. Rugby barely nodded to her and went on with his work. He was cutting glass at a bench. "Good morning, Nancy," Mr. Bradshaw said cheerfully. "I've been thinking that the best way for you to start learning the window-making process would be to make a few sketches, any kind you wish. Then I'll tell you whether they would divide up well for letting." He led Nancy to a drawing board, gave her a smock, paper, and some crayons, then went back to his own work. Nancy sat, lost in thought for several minutes, then drew a sketch of her dog Togo. She used a background of flowering azaleas and forsythia. Not satisfied with the sketch, she next tried a religious subject. In all, she made 5 before calling Mr. Bradshaw. "I'm ready," she said. All this time, Nancy had been aware that Alonzo Rugby had been watching her covertly. He continually found excuses to leave his workbench and glance at Nancy's sketches. Several times it seemed as though he wanted to say something, but had thought better of it and gone back to his own work. Mr. Bradshaw now looked at the various pictures she had made. "You do have talent," he said, smiling. "I especially like the picture of the little dog. Is he yours?" Nancy nodded. Mr. Bradshaw finally remarked that while it would not be impossible to make stained glass windows from any of the sketches, none of them was exactly right for the best letting process. "When using human figures," he said, "it is advisable to show them in an upright position, or if they're leaning over, they must be seen in profile. The same applies to animals. Your picture of the dog is very appealing, but with the light coming through a window, his figure would look foreshortened." Nancy thanked the artist for his constructive comments. "I'll make a few more sketches," she said. A banjo clock on the studio wall had just chimed 11:30 when Nancy finished her next one. She had drawn a peacock, its fan spread wide open. She felt that if Mr. Bradshaw and Rugby saw it, possibly one or the other would show an unusual interest he might have in the gray stone window. On impulse, Nancy had made the peacock the size she thought the bird on the shield might be. "It's pretty good, even if I say so myself," the young sleuth thought. As she gazed at it, wondering whether she should call Mr. Bradshaw over, the artist suddenly stood up. He announced that he was going outside to look for a flower of a certain shade of blue to use in a window. "I'll be right back," he said. Nancy fervently hoped Alonzo would follow. Then she could compare his shoe with the paper pattern. But she was disappointed. The assistant did get up, but instead of going out the door, he turned and came directly to Nancy's drawing board. "How do you like it?" she asked casually. Alonzo snorted. "Pretty bad," he said. "You ought to be ashamed of yourself taking up Mr. Bradshaw's time. Anyone can see that you're no artist. Where did you get the idea you were?" Nancy was stunned for a moment by his sharp criticism. She decided, however, that he was still trying to discourage her from coming to the studio. Aloud, she said, "I'll see what Mr. Bradshaw has to say about it." Alonzo Rugby's eyes blazed. Before Nancy could stop him, he grabbed the sketch from the drawing board, crumpled it into a tight wad, and threw it forcefully across the room. It landed in the fireplace among ashes and half-burned logs. End of chapter 8.